Eric Montgomery wasn't a man who sought trouble. In fact, he spent most of his life avoiding it. He had earned his independence the hard way through decades of working with his hands, restoring broken-down machines and salvaging forgotten cars in his now-closed auto shop. He was no dreamer, no idealist. Eric valued function over form, simplicity over extravagance. After retiring early at 52, with enough money to live a quiet life, he bought a home that was as raw and straightforward as he was. A century-old brick house tucked in a quiet corner of an upscale suburban neighborhood. It was different from the bland beige boxes that surrounded it, a stubborn relic of another time. Its dark, weathered bricks, the cast iron gates out front, and the heavy oak door gave it a rugged, almost foreboding presence. The HOA hated it, and maybe that was part of the reason Eric loved it so much. When Eric first moved in, the neighborhood welcomed him with forced smiles and passive curiosity. The HOA president, Mr. Devlin, a middle-aged man with too much cologne and a plastered grin, had dropped by that first week with a welcome package that looked more like a rulebook. It contained pamphlets on lawn care standards, paint color requirements, and a thick document titled Community Guidelines. Devlin, with his polished shoes gleaming on Eric's dusty front porch, had smiled like a salesman as he explained, "We pride ourselves on maintaining harmony in the neighborhood, Mr. Montgomery. It's what keeps property values high and our streets looking beautiful." Eric barely listened, his mind already drifting to the cracked fence he'd spotted in the backyard. "I'll take care of my place," he'd said, not unkindly but firmly enough to send a clear message. Devlin's smile faltered for half a second before it returned, stiff and insincere. "I'm sure you will," he'd replied before leaving Eric with the package, which he promptly stuffed in a kitchen drawer, unopened and forgotten. The first few months passed quietly. Eric busied himself with projects replacing old pipes in the basement, sanding the wooden banister on the staircase, and restoring the wrought iron gates that framed his property. Neighbors kept their distance, which suited him just fine. Occasionally he would notice someone driving by slowly, peering at his house with thinly veiled disapproval. Once he overheard a woman whispering to her husband during her evening walk, "It's a shame they let that house stay. Doesn't fit the neighborhood at all." Eric couldn't care less. The house didn't fit because it wasn't meant to. It had a soul, something the soulless hoe couldn't understand. He liked the way it creaked when he walked through its hallways late at night, the way sunlight caught the stained glass in the dining room, casting fractured patterns on the floor. It was his fortress, and he took pride in knowing that every repair, every restoration, was something he'd done with his own hands. It was on a warm Friday evening, after a week-long fishing trip, that everything changed. Eric pulled his battered truck into the driveway and immediately felt that something was wrong. The house looked different. He killed the engine and stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. The closer he got, the more his stomach sank. His home, the brick fortress that had stood unchanged for over a century, was now a pale, uniform beige. The bricks had been covered in thick, industrial paint, their texture obliterated, their history erased. The wrought iron gates were gone, replaced with flimsy white picket fencing that looked as though it had been dragged straight from a cheap catalog. Eric stood there, motionless, trying to process what he was seeing. He glanced at the windows as beautiful stained glass had been replaced with generic double panes. The heavy oak door was now a hollow, modern monstrosity painted an unnatural shade of white. The soul of the house, the very things that made it his, were gone, violated. On the front porch, a large envelope lay taped to the newly painted wall. It bore the HOA's logo in bold letters. Eric ripped it open with trembling hands. Inside was an invoice, exterior restoration in compliance with community standards, total due $30,000. A cold rage settled over him, its weight pressing against his chest. His fingers tightened around the papers as he scanned the text. The HOA had sanctioned the work under a mandatory aesthetic upgrade clause buried somewhere in the community guidelines. Apparently they had sent multiple notices while he was away. Devlin's name was scrawled at the bottom of the invoice, next to a smug little note. "We've taken the liberty of restoring your home to fit the community's vision. Payment is due within 30 days. Eric clenched his jaw, his teeth grinding so hard they hurt. Their vision. They had destroyed his house, his fortress, his pride. He looked up again at the pale, lifeless facade and felt something snap inside him. This wasn't just about paint. This was an invasion and erasure of everything that made his house unique, of everything that made it his. Without thinking, he grabbed the handle of the new front door and pushed it open. It felt cheap and hollow, swinging too easily on its hinges. Inside, the violations continued. The handcrafted wooden trim around the door frames had been stripped and replaced with mass-produced molding. The intricate ceiling medallion in the living room, an original feature he'd carefully restored, was gone, replaced with a plain, flat surface. It was like walking into a stranger's home. Eric's hands trembled as he sank onto the bare wooden steps of his staircase. The house felt empty, like a body without a soul. Devlin and his HOA had crossed a line, and they weren't going to get away with it. Not this time. Eric Montgomery wasn't the type to back down, and if the HOA thought they could bully him into silence, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. As he sat there, staring at the wreckage of his home, a single thought crystallized in his mind. They've picked the wrong man to mess with. Eric didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the dark of his gutted living room, staring at the cheap white walls that mocked him. The house, once filled with the warmth of age and character, felt sterile and cold. Around 3 a.m., he finally moved, opening the envelope again and spreading its contents on the table. The invoice was accompanied by a formal letter, typed in the same passive-aggressive tone HOA letters always seem to have. Dear Mr. Montgomery, in accordance with Section 14C of the Community Guidelines, all properties in the Millbrook subdivision must comply with the revised architectural standardization policy passed by unanimous vote of the HOA board. After numerous attempts to contact you via mail and phone regarding non-compliance, the necessary restorations were executed on your behalf to bring your property in line with neighborhood aesthetics. Attached is an itemized invoice for services rendered. Failure to remit payment within 30 days will result in late fees and a potential lien on the property. Sincerely, Arthur Devlin, President, Millbrook Homeowners Association. Executed on your behalf. Eric read those words again and again, his knuckles white as his grip tightened around the letter. It was as if they expected him to thank them for gutting his home, for reducing everything he loved about it to a bland, soulless shell. And the cherry on top, a lien. They were threatening to put a lien on his house if he didn't pay for the vandalism they had inflicted on him. By morning, Eric was pacing the perimeter of his property, clutching a steaming cup of coffee in his shaking hand. He inspected the damage in daylight, every detail stoking the fire inside him. The wrought iron gates, those heavy, intricate works of art he had restored himself, weren't just removed, they'd been cut apart, torched at the joints, and discarded like scrap metal. His stained glass windows had been shattered and replaced, and as he looked closer, he noticed a few jagged shards of colored glass still caught in the dirt under the window frames. He crouched down, picking up a shard and holding it up to the sunlight, watching the light refract through it. The blue and red patterns seemed to scream against the pale, lifeless backdrop of the house. They didn't just paint it, he muttered to himself, rising to his feet. They butchered it. Determined to confront Devlin directly, Eric stormed toward the HOA office later that morning, an unassuming single-story building tucked away in a strip mall. He nearly tore the glass door off its hinges as he entered. A bored receptionist glanced up from behind the desk, chewing gum like she couldn't care less about anything in the world. Mr. Devlin, Eric barked. Now! The receptionist blinked lazily. Do you have an appointment? Tell him Montgomery's here, Eric shot back. I'll wait all damn day if I have to. Apparently, his tone was convincing enough, because she disappeared into the back. A few minutes later, Arthur Devlin emerged from his office, dressed in a perfectly pressed suit and wearing the smug, punchable expression of someone who's always gotten their way. Eric. Devlin spread his arms as though greeting an old friend. What brings you in today? Eric walked straight up to him, practically chest to chest. You know damn well why I'm here. What the hell did you do to my house? Devlin's smile didn't waver. We brought it up to code, Eric. You were in violation of the architectural standards. We sent you plenty of notices. I never saw a single one. We mailed everything to the address on file. Devlin shrugged innocently. If you didn't receive them, that's hardly our fault. Eric felt the heat rising in his face. You had no right to touch my property. You destroyed everything I've worked for, everything that made that house mine. And now you're demanding I pay you for it? It's not about the money, Devlin said smoothly. It's about the integrity of our community. Millbrook has certain standards, and we can't let one property drag everyone else down. I'm sure you understand. Eric stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. I don't give a damn about your standards. You think you can just bulldoze people into submission? Not me, Devlin. Not this time. Devlin's smile faltered slightly. You can yell all you want, Eric, but this is already done. If you refuse to pay, the board will have no choice but to escalate. A lien will be placed on your home, and eventually, well, you know how this goes. There it was. The veiled threat, delivered with that same calm condescension that made Eric's blood boil. Devlin patted Eric's arm like he was dismissing a petulant child. I suggest you read the guidelines more carefully next time. Eric slapped his hand away. You think you can intimidate me? Not at all, Devlin said with a smirk. This is just business, Eric. Nothing personal. Eric turned and stormed out of the office, his heart pounding like a jackhammer. Business. That's what Devlin called this, ripping apart someone's home and demanding a ransom to get away with it. Eric wasn't a man who picked fights, but he wasn't a man to walk away from one either. Not when it mattered. And this mattered. Back at home, Eric dug through every drawer, every filing cabinet, until he found what he was looking for, the original purchase agreement for his house. He scanned the pages until he found the section about HOA membership. There it was in black and white: membership in the Millbrook HOA is voluntary. Voluntary. Eric stared at the word, barely believing it. He wasn't obligated to comply with their ridiculous rules. Devlin had lied. The updates were illegal, and the threats of lines and late fees were nothing but intimidation tactics. But as Eric sat there, the victory felt hollow. Even if Devlin had no legal right, what was done was done. His house was gone, its soul painted over and dismantled piece by piece. That night, Eric sat on his porch, drinking cheap whiskey straight from the bottle as he stared at the blank, beige walls. He knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let this stand. Devlin and his hoe thought they could steamroll him, just like they had done to everyone else. But they didn't know Eric Montgomery. He wasn't going to take this lying down. Nothing personal, Eric muttered under his breath, repeating Devlin's words. He leaned back in his chair, the glass shard of stained glass still in his hand, catching the faint glow of the streetlight. We'll see about that. Eric woke up the next morning with a throbbing headache and the bitter taste of whiskey still in his mouth. The events of the previous day felt like a fever dream until he walked out onto the porch and saw his house, his butchered house, in the harsh light of day. The sterile beige walls, the hollow door, the absence of the wrought iron gates, it was all real. It hit him again like a punch to the gut. By mid-morning, he had thrown together a plan. He wasn't a lawyer, but he was a man who could dig through paperwork and find the truth. Eric sat at his kitchen table with stacks of documents spread around him: the deed to the house, the purchase agreement, old homeowner association pamphlets he had ignored when he first moved in. That word voluntary stared back at him, mocking every threat Devlin had made. He combed through the fine print, determined to find the hole that would unravel the HOA's grip. Around noon, he drove to the county records office downtown. The building was cold and sterile, filled with rows of filing cabinets and humming fluorescent lights. Eric didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he knew enough to follow his gut. He pulled every public document related to the HOA meeting minutes, updated guidelines, amendments to neighborhood bylaws. It was all public record, and he'd be damned if he didn't take advantage of that. He spent hours scanning page after page, piecing together the story of Millbrook's hoe. The deeper he dug, the uglier it got. 2 years ago, under Devlin's leadership, the HOA had rewritten its architectural guidelines and bylaws, forcing mandatory compliance on all properties within Millbrook. They had passed the changes quietly, with no notices sent to homeowners except a buried footnote in the monthly newsletter one Eric had never bothered to read. Eric clenched his jaw, fury bubbling up in his chest. Devlin had found a loophole, one that gave the HOA a stranglehold over homeowners who didn't push back. They'd start with small fines and threats, escalating to liens and property seizures if anyone refused to pay. It was a racket, a slow-moving machine that squeezed people dry under the guise of community improvement. And Devlin had used Eric's house as a high-profile example to scare the others into submission. "Bastard," Eric muttered under his breath, shoving the papers into a folder. But one document stood out. A list of recent foreclosures showed that over the last 18 months, 5 homes in Millbrook had gone into HOA-initiated foreclosure for non-compliance or unpaid dues. All 5 properties had been sold at suspiciously low prices to the same real estate development company, Westbrook Properties, LLC. Eric didn't know much about corporate law, but he knew a rigged game when he saw one. Westbrook wasn't just buying homes, it was taking them, stripping them down, and flipping them for a fortune. And then there was his house. Devlin had tried to intimidate him with fines and a lien, but Eric realized he was standing in the way of something bigger. Millbrook wasn't a community, it was a feeding ground, and Devlin was the wolf leading the pack. That evening, Eric drove home feeling the weight of his discovery. He pulled into his driveway just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over his property. The silence was oppressive, the neighborhood eerily still. For a moment, Eric wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him, if the paranoia was creeping in too deep. But then he saw it. Tacked to his front door was another notice, this one printed in bold red letters. "Final warning, payment overdue, immediate action required." Eric ripped it down, crumpling the paper in his fist. As he stood there, his eyes caught movement across the street. A black SUV was parked at the curb, its engine idling. Through the tinted windows, he couldn't see who was inside, but he knew they were watching him. His blood turned cold, but his anger burned hotter. He took a deliberate step toward the SUV, his glare fixed like a weapon. For a moment, the vehicle didn't move. Then, as if sensing his challenge, it pulled away, tires crunching softly on the asphalt. Eric's fists clenched at his sides. It wasn't just intimidation anymore, this was a message. They were watching him, waiting for him to fall in line. But they didn't know Eric Montgomery. That night, Eric took action. He grabbed his tools, a crowbar, a flashlight, and a sledgehammer, and went to work. He started in the basement, where remnants of the original house still clung to life. The HOA's contractors had painted over everything, but Eric suspected they hadn't bothered to go deeper. Behind a flimsy sheet of drywall in one corner, he found a patch of the original brick wall, untouched and unpainted. As he knocked through it, dust clouding the beam of his flashlight, Eric felt something solid give way. A small, narrow recess revealed itself in the brick. Inside it sat a rusted metal box, about the size of a shoebox, covered in decades of grime. Eric pulled it free and carried it upstairs, setting it carefully on the kitchen table. He stared at it for a long moment, his pulse quickening. Whatever this was, someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. With a screwdriver, Eric pried the box open. Inside were old documents, yellowed and brittle, handwritten in faded ink. Most of it was indecipherable, but one word caught his eye: Westbrook. Alongside the papers sat a photograph, curling at the edges. It was a black and white image of his house, but not as it was now. The wrought iron gates were there, as were the stained glass windows. Standing on the porch were 3 men in suits, one of whom looked eerily familiar. Arthur Devlin. Eric stared at the photo, his heart pounding. It couldn't be him. The photo had to be at least 70 years old, but the resemblance was undeniable. He flipped the picture over. Scrawled on the back were 2 words: "The Gate." "What the hell is this?" Eric muttered. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of a puzzle he didn't yet understand. Westbrook Properties, Devlin, and now this photograph, somehow it all connected to his house. The whole wasn't just enforcing arbitrary rules. They were covering something up, something old and dangerous. As the realization settled over him, Eric heard a noise outside, soft footsteps on gravel. He froze, his body tensing. The porch creaked, and then came a sharp, deliberate knock at the door. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Whoever it was knocked again, harder this time. "Eric," a voice called through the door. It was Devlin. "We need to talk." Eric's eyes flicked to the metal box and its contents. He knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Whatever Devlin wanted, whatever secret lay hidden beneath his house, Eric wasn't going to let them take it. Not without a fight. Eric stood frozen, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. Devlin's voice on the other side of the door sounded calm, almost too calm, like a snake whispering before a strike. "Eric," Devlin repeated, louder this time, "we know you're in there. Let's have a civilized conversation, shall we?" Eric didn't trust himself to speak. Instead, he looked down at the rusted metal box and its unsettling contents. The photograph with Devlin's face, or someone who looked just like him, burned in his mind. His instincts told him that whatever was going on wasn't just about HOA compliance or property value anymore. This was deeper, older, and Eric had just scratched the surface. The knock stopped, replaced by silence. Eric stayed rooted to the spot, listening, but there was no sound of retreating footsteps. After what felt like an eternity, he crept to the window and peered outside. Devlin's black SUV was still parked at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the porch light. Eric couldn't see anyone, but he could feel Devlin's presence lingering, watching, waiting. Eric grabbed the box and stashed it under the loose floorboard in his bedroom. He wasn't ready to play his hand. Not yet. Whatever Devlin wanted, he wasn't going to get it, not until Eric understood exactly what he was holding. The next morning, Eric decided to pay a visit to someone who might have answers. A name scribbled in the corner of one of the yellowed papers had stood out to him: Harlan Kane County Assessor's Office. Eric remembered seeing the name on a plaque during one of his visits to the records department. If anyone knew about the history of the neighborhood, it would be Harlan. The drive to the county assessor's office was uneventful, but Eric couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every so often, a black sedan would appear in his rearview mirror, only to disappear when he took a turn. He told himself he was imagining things, but the gnawing paranoia had dug its claws in deep. When he arrived at the assessor's office, Harlan Kane was exactly the man Eric expected: mid-70s, thin as a rail, with wire-rimmed glasses perched on a hawk-like nose. He sat hunched behind a desk cluttered with decades' worth of paper, a relic of a bygone era surrounded by file cabinets and dust. "Help you?" Harlan asked, squinting up at Eric with watery eyes. "I need to know about the history of Millbrook, specifically the houses," Eric said, pulling the photograph from his jacket pocket. "Ever seen this before?" Harlan took the picture and leaned back, holding it up to the flickering fluorescent light. His brow furrowed, and he let out a slow, wheezing breath. "Where'd you get this?" "It was hidden in my house." "What do you know about it?" Harlan's lips pressed into a thin line. He set the photo down and folded his hands on the desk. "Millbrook's an old neighborhood, older than it looks. Most people think the houses were built in the early 20th century, but some of those lots have been around since the late 1800s. "And the tunnels?" Eric interjected. "The ones underneath the houses?" Harlan's eyes widened a fraction, but he recovered quickly. "You shouldn't be poking around down there. Those tunnels were sealed off for a reason." "What reason?" Harlan hesitated, glancing toward the door, as though someone might be listening. "Back when the area was first settled, there was a landowner, Gideon Westbrook, wealthy man. Built the foundations for half the properties around here, including yours. But there were rumors, bad ones. People talked about secret chambers and passages connecting the homes, like some kind of underground network." "Why?" Eric pressed. "No one really knows," Harlan said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Some say Westbrook was part of a secret society. Others say he was hiding something: gold, artifacts, you name it. Whatever it was, people started disappearing. Workers, tenants, anyone who dug too deep. The tunnels were eventually sealed, and Westbrook vanished. But the houses he built," Harlan tapped the photograph with one bony finger, "they were marked." Eric stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "Marked for what?" "Gideon Westbrook didn't build homes, son. He built vaults." Eric's blood ran cold. Vaults. For what purpose he couldn't guess, but it explained why the HOA was so determined to get their hands on his property. "Arthur Devlin," Eric said, watching Harlan's expression carefully. "You know him?" Harlan's face twitched, a flicker of something that might have been fear. "Devlin's not his real name. He's been around longer than you think, pulling strings from behind the scenes. Whatever's under that house of yours, he wants it. And he'll burn the whole neighborhood down to get it." Eric didn't need to hear more. He snatched the photo and left the office, his mind racing. Vaults. Tunnels. Devlin. It was all connected, and he was standing in the middle of it. When Eric returned home, the black SUV was waiting for him. It was parked a few houses down this time, its engine running. Eric didn't bother confronting it. Instead, he went inside, locked the doors, and grabbed the metal box from its hiding place. He spent the next several hours trying to decode the papers inside: maps, scrawled notes, diagrams of houses that looked eerily similar to his own. Around midnight, Eric noticed a faint sound coming from beneath the floorboards. A rhythmic thud, 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 like distant hammering. He froze, straining his ears to listen. It wasn't coming from inside the house. It was coming from below. The tunnels. Eric grabbed his flashlight and headed for the basement. He stood in the center of the concrete floor, staring at the faint outline of bricks that didn't match the rest of the foundation. He knelt down and ran his hands over the surface, feeling for weaknesses. With a crowbar and a surge of adrenaline, he pried the bricks loose, one by one, until a dark void revealed itself beneath him. A tunnel. The air was damp and stale, heavy with the scent of earth and time. Eric descended into the darkness, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the black. The tunnel stretched farther than he expected, the walls lined with ancient brick and symbols he couldn't decipher. After walking for what felt like hours, Eric reached a dead end. But there, in the center of the wall, was something unexpected, a massive iron door set into the stone. Its surface was covered in strange carvings, and at the center, a symbol that matched the one on the photograph. The gate. Eric's flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering. The distant sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnel, growing louder. Someone was coming. Eric turned back, his pulse racing as he sprinted toward the opening in his basement. The footsteps followed, faster now, chasing him through the darkness. When he finally climbed out and sealed the bricks back in place, he collapsed on the basement floor, gasping for breath. He had seen enough. The gate was real. The tunnels were real. And someone, Devlin or whoever he really was, wasn't going to stop until they opened it. Eric wiped the sweat from his face, his resolve hardening. Whatever secrets lay beneath his house, they weren't meant to be uncovered. Not by him, not by anyone. But Devlin had made one mistake. He had underestimated Eric Montgomery. And Eric wasn't about to let them win. Eric didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the floor as though the tunnels below might open up and swallow him whole. The iron door, the symbols, the echo of footsteps, whoever was down there had been close, too close. He couldn't shake the image of that gate, its carvings like something out of an ancient nightmare. The papers in the metal box, with their indecipherable scrawls, suddenly felt heavier, more dangerous. They weren't just cryptic blueprints or relics, they were a warning, and someone wanted to silence it. Morning came with an oppressive stillness. Eric walked outside, his senses on high alert, searching for any sign of movement. Devlin's SUV was gone, but Eric knew better than to think the man had given up. If anything, this was just the calm before a bigger storm. By midday, the storm hit. A letter arrived in his mailbox, this one thicker, more official looking than the last. Eric tore it open and scanned the first few lines, his jaw tightening. Notice of foreclosure proceedings due to non-compliance and outstanding dues. The letter claimed his failure to pay the $30,000 invoice had initiated the process, and unless the debt was settled within 10 days, his house would be seized. Eric crushed the paper in his fist, his pulse pounding in his ears. He knew Devlin was behind this. The foreclosure wasn't about compliance or dues, it was about control. Devlin was using the HOA as a weapon, trying to drive Eric out and take whatever lay beneath the house for himself. But Eric wouldn't budge. If Devlin wanted to play dirty, Eric would fight him on his terms. His first stop was the county clerk's office. Eric wasn't a lawyer, but he'd spent enough time fixing broken cars and machines to know that if something looked rigged, it probably was. He pored over the foreclosure paperwork, combing through the fine print and highlighting inconsistencies. Devlin had rushed the process, bypassing several steps required by state law. It wasn't much, but it was enough to slow him down. That evening, Eric installed locks on every window and door in the house. He reinforced the basement entrance with a heavy steel plate bolted into the floor, as though he could physically barricade himself from the darkness below. By the time he finished, the sun had set, and the house felt unnervingly quiet. Eric poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat by the window, watching the street. He felt like a man under siege, and in a way he was. The neighborhood that had once been a picture of suburban peace now felt like enemy territory. Across the street, lights turned off one by one. Curtains twitched when he passed. Everyone was watching him, and no one was willing to help. Around midnight, a loud thud jolted Eric awake. He dozed off in his chair, but now his heart was racing. The sound had come from the backyard. He grabbed the heavy flashlight he kept on the side table and crept toward the back door, careful not to make a sound. Through the window, he saw them two figures, both dressed in dark clothes, moving toward the basement entrance. One held a crowbar, the other a heavy toolbox. Eric's stomach turned as he realized what was happening. They were trying to get into the tunnels. "Not on my watch," Eric muttered, his anger cutting through the adrenaline. He grabbed the old hunting rifle he kept under the couch, checking the chamber before easing open the back door. The two men were hunched over the basement entrance, oblivious to Eric's presence. He stepped into the yard, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Get the hell off my property," Eric barked, leveling the rifle. The men froze. One of them, the taller of the two, straightened and turned to face him. Eric couldn't see his face under the hood, but he saw the glint of something in his hand, a long, thin tool that looked like a crowbar. "Put it down," Eric warned, his voice ice cold. "I'm not going to say it again." The second man bolted, disappearing over the fence in a matter of seconds. The tall one hesitated, his shoulders squaring as though deciding whether to make a move. Eric didn't wait to find out. He fired a single shot into the dirt by the man's feet. The crack of the rifle echoed through the night like thunder. The man dropped the crowbar and sprinted after his partner, vaulting over the fence and vanishing into the darkness. Eric stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving, the rifle still aimed at empty space. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A light flicked on in a neighboring house, but no one came outside. No one ever did. Eric secured the basement entrance again, double-checking every lock before collapsing onto the couch. His hands were still trembling as he set the rifle down. This wasn't just harassment anymore. Whoever those men were, they weren't petty HOA contractors, they were something else entirely. The next morning, Eric found a note pinned to his front door with a rusted nail. The paper was old, almost brittle, and the handwriting jagged and strange. "You can't keep it sealed forever. The gate will open." Eric tore the note down, his pulse hammering. He didn't know who had left it, Devlin, the men from the night before, or someone else entirely, but the message was clear. They were done playing games. By the time Eric arrived at the HOA office later that day, he was seething. Devlin wasn't in the front, the receptionist, a different one this time, younger and more nervous, tried to stall him. "Mr. Devlin's not available," she stammered. Eric leaned over the counter, his voice a low growl. "Get him out here, or I'm kicking down his damn door." That did the trick. Moments later, Devlin appeared, looking as polished and smug as ever. "Eric," he said, his tone patronizing, "you're becoming a real thorn in my side." "What the hell were your men doing at my house last night?" Eric demanded, his fists clenched. Devlin's expression didn't change. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Cut the crap," Eric spat. "They were trying to get into the basement, into the tunnels." "What are you looking for, Devlin? What's so important that you're willing to burn my life to the ground?" Devlin's smile faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. "You've got an overactive imagination, Eric. I suggest you take this." He slid a thick manila envelope across the counter. "It's the final foreclosure notice. You have 10 days to comply, or you'll lose your house. Eric snatched the envelope, his anger bubbling over. This isn't over, Devlin. Devlin's eyes darkened. No, Eric, he said softly. It's just beginning. Eric stormed out of the office, the envelope crumpled in his fist. As he drove home, his mind raced. He knew now that Devlin wasn't just after his property, he was after what lay beneath it. The gate. The tunnels. Whatever was buried down there, it was dangerous enough for Devlin to send men in the dead of night to retrieve it. But Eric wasn't going to let them win. If Devlin wanted a war, he'd get one. And Eric Montgomery would make damn sure they regretted coming after him. Eric spent the next 2 days preparing for what he knew was coming. Every instinct told him that Devlin and his people weren't going to wait out the foreclosure notice. They wanted the tunnels, the gate, whatever secrets lay hidden under his house, and they'd stop at nothing to get it. He reinforced the basement entrance one final time, bolting steel plates across the floor and barricading it with heavy tools and furniture. Upstairs, he laid out his supplies, an old hunting rifle, a crowbar, a flashlight, and a hammer. The house, gutted and vandalized by the HOA's so-called improvements, now felt more like a fortress. On the third night, it happened. Eric was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee, when he heard it, a low, metallic groan coming from the basement. He froze, listening intently. For a moment there was silence. Then came the unmistakable sound of something being pried open, a steady, rhythmic scrape, like metal on metal. Not tonight, Eric muttered, grabbing the rifle. He descended the basement stairs, the air growing colder with every step. The scraping noise grew louder, closer. As Eric reached the bottom, his flashlight beam swept across the room, and then stopped. The steel plates he'd bolted across the floor had been ripped apart, torn up like paper. The basement entrance gaped open, a dark maw leading into the tunnels. Standing over it, holding a crowbar, was one of Devlin's men, the tall figure Eric had confronted in his yard days earlier. Behind him, 2 others were already lowering themselves into the hole, disappearing into the darkness below. The tall man turned at the sound of Eric's boots on the floor. For the first time, Eric saw his face, a scarred, hollow-cheeked man with cold, empty eyes. You shouldn't have locked it, Montgomery, the man said, his voice a gravelly snarl. Eric didn't hesitate. He leveled the rifle. Get out of my house. The man sneered. This house isn't yours anymore. He raised the crowbar and took a step forward. Eric fired. The shot missed by inches, punching a hole into the basement wall, but it was enough. The man flinched, dropped the crowbar, and bolted toward the stairs. Eric didn't chase him. Instead, he turned to the open entrance, shining his flashlight down into the void. The other 2 men were already deep into the tunnels, their voices echoing faintly through the walls. Eric didn't have time to think. He grabbed the crowbar, shoved the rifle over his shoulder, and dropped down into the hole. His boots hit the dirt floor of the tunnel with a thud, dust swirling around his feet. The air was damp and heavy, filled with the scent of mold and old earth. Ahead of him, faint beams of light bobbed in the darkness, flashlights held by Devlin's men. He followed them, moving carefully but quickly. The tunnel stretched on longer than he remembered, its walls lined with symbols and markings he couldn't begin to decipher. The farther he went, the colder it got. His breath turned visible, and a shiver ran down his spine. Somewhere up ahead, the 2 men shouted to each other, their voices urgent. Eric rounded a corner just in time to see them forcing open the massive iron door of the gate. The men strained against it, their tools scraping and clanging against the metal. With a final heave, the door groaned open, releasing a blast of icy air that made Eric's skin prickle. For a moment, everything was still. The men stepped back, their flashlights aimed into the dark space beyond. What is it? One of them whispered. Before the other could answer, a deep, resonant thud echoed from the other side of the gate, followed by a low, guttural sound that made Eric's stomach drop. It wasn't human. The 2 men froze, their flashlights trembling. We need to go," one of them stammered. "No." The other shook his head, as if hypnotized. "We came this far. We need to see." Eric watched from the shadows as the men stepped through the gate, their figures swallowed by the darkness beyond. For a moment there was silence. Then came the screams, horrible, ragged screams that cut through the air like knives. The flashlights dropped, clattering to the ground and rolling toward the doorway. Eric saw just enough to know he didn't want to see more. He turned and ran, sprinting through the tunnel as the screaming continued behind him. His flashlight bobbed wildly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The air seemed to close in around him, pressing against his chest, as though the tunnels themselves were alive. When he reached the basement opening, Eric scrambled up the ladder and onto the floor, his hands shaking. But he wasn't alone. Standing at the top of the basement stairs, calm as ever, was Arthur Devlin. He looked down at Eric with an almost amused expression, his hands tucked neatly into his pockets. "Quite the discovery, isn't it?" Devlin said, his voice smooth and cold. "I warned you not to get involved." Eric staggered to his feet, gripping the crowbar like a weapon. "What the hell is down there?" Devlin tilted his head, his smile sharpening. "Something that should have stayed buried. Unfortunately for you, Eric, you've seen too much." Devlin took a step forward, and Eric didn't wait to hear more. He lunged, swinging the crowbar with every ounce of strength he had. Devlin sidestepped it, but Eric didn't stop. He swung again, the crowbar connecting with the banister and shattering wood. Devlin's smug expression finally faltered, and Eric used the moment to shove past him, charging up the stairs. "Montgomery," Devlin shouted, his voice echoing through the house. Eric didn't look back. He sprinted through the gutted living room, out the front door, and into the yard. The cold night air stung his face as he ran to his truck, fumbling with the keys. Behind him, the house loomed, its windows dark and empty. He could feel Devlin watching him, though he couldn't see him. The engine roared to life, and Eric peeled out of the driveway, gravel kicking up behind him. As he sped down the street, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw his house, framed against the night sky, with dark shapes moving in the basement windows. Eric didn't stop driving until he hit the highway, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. His mind raced, replaying everything he'd seen: the gate, the screams, the look in Devlin's eyes. Whatever secrets lay beneath that house were beyond him, beyond anything he could fight. But one thing was clear: Devlin wasn't finished. And neither was Eric. As he drove, Eric made a silent promise to himself. If Devlin wanted the gate open so badly, Eric would do whatever it took to make sure it stayed sealed no matter the cost. Eric didn't stop until the house was a distant memory in his rearview mirror. The hum of the engine was the only sound as he barreled down the empty highway, the events of the night replaying in his mind like a fevered dream. Devlin's face, cold and calculating, the gate yawning open, the screams of men who never should have gone near it, and the dark shapes moving behind the windows as he fled. Whatever secrets had been buried under that house, under Millbrook, they were no longer his concern. But he knew one thing: it wasn't over. Eric spent the next day in a roadside motel on the outskirts of town, the curtains drawn and his truck hidden around back. He kept the rifle close, sitting on the edge of the bed and staring at the door as though it might burst open at any moment. Devlin wouldn't let him walk away. The man or whatever he was had made that much clear. By afternoon, Eric had made up his mind. He wasn't a hero, and he wasn't some crusader, but he couldn't let Devlin and his people have what they wanted. Whatever was behind that gate wasn't meant to see the light of day. Eric had no doubt that Devlin would try again, sending more men, more tools, and more threats until he got what he wanted. But Eric still had the one thing Devlin didn't: his house. That evening, Eric returned to Millbrook. The neighborhood was quiet as he pulled onto his street, every window dark, every lawn still. The place felt deserted, like the entire community had fallen into a collective silence. Eric parked his truck down the road and walked the rest of the way, carrying a heavy duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Inside it were cans of gasoline, a box of matches, and everything he needed to end this once and for all. The house loomed before him, hollow and lifeless. The pale beige paint Devlin's contractors had slapped on it in their restoration seemed to glow under the moonlight, as though the house itself knew what was coming. Eric didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, pouring gasoline across the floorboards, along the walls, and down into the basement. The acrid smell filled the air, but Eric didn't stop. When he reached the basement entrance, he paused, staring down into the darkness. He could still hear it, that faint, rhythmic thud echoing from somewhere far below. The gate, it was waiting, calling. Eric gritted his teeth and emptied the last of the gasoline into the hole. He stood back, struck a match, and let it fall. The flames caught instantly, racing across the gasoline and consuming everything in their path. The fire spread faster than Eric expected, a roaring inferno that filled the basement with thick, black smoke. Eric stumbled back, coughing, but he didn't stop to watch. He turned and ran, shoving through the front door as the heat followed him like a living thing. By the time Eric reached the street, the house was engulfed. Flames leapt from the windows, the roof already starting to collapse under the weight of the fire. The heat was unbearable, the air shimmering with it. Eric stood in the middle of the road, watching as the house that had been his pride, his fortress, burned to the ground. And then he saw them. Across the street, in the shadows, figures stood watching. Devlin was there, his pristine suit illuminated by the firelight. His face was calm, unreadable, but his eyes burned with something that sent a chill through Eric even from a distance. Beside him, other men stood silently, their faces obscured, their postures stiff. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply watched as the house turned to ash. Eric met Devlin's gaze, refusing to look away. He couldn't stop the fire that was now consuming his past, but he could damn well make sure Devlin knew who had lit the match. After what felt like an eternity, Devlin turned and disappeared into the dark, the others following silently behind him. Eric didn't watch them go. He stayed there until the fire trucks arrived, sirens cutting through the night air, neighbors finally peeking out from behind their curtains. By then, the house was little more than smoldering ruins. The basement collapsed, the tunnels buried beneath tons of debris and ash. It was over. In the weeks that followed, Eric vanished from Millbrook. He didn't stick around to hear the whispers about what happened that night. He didn't care what Devlin told the HOA board or how they tried to spin the fire as an accident. He didn't need to hear it, because he knew the truth. The gate was sealed. The tunnels were gone. And whatever Devlin had been looking for, whatever terrible thing he was trying to unleash, had been buried forever. Eric didn't look back. He drove west, leaving the ruins of Millbrook behind. Sometimes, late at night, he'd wonder if Devlin was still out there, still digging, still searching. And sometimes he'd dream of the gate, the carvings, the endless dark, the sound of something waiting on the other side. But then he'd wake up, his hands steady and his mind clear. Eric Montgomery didn't need answers. He didn't need closure. He'd done what had to be done. And for a man like Eric, that was enough. As he drove toward the horizon, he glanced once at the rearview mirror, at the life he had left behind. Then he turned the radio up, pressed his foot to the gas, and didn't look back again.